So now that we have those basics, let's dig into how I create stories that work with different customers. I use a positioning matrix. And the positioning matrix can be thought of as a Rubik's Cube or as something, basically it's a matrix that combines evidence and some very specific pivot points and lets you weave a story that maps to the situation at hand. This method I've developed over the 20 years that I've worked in the business as a consultant, and it really combines the best of both worlds in telling stories and in positioning and messaging. It gives me the ability to have consistent messages that are standard no matter what story I'm telling, and it also gives me the ability to modify each and every story so that I match it to my specific audience. So let's talk a little bit about how we do this. First, let's talk about the basics of the positioning matrix, and then we'll go into more detail. So one of the basics is evidence. The first thing I do when I go into a company is I go and I collect evidence. I gather that evidence a little bit from the inside, but mostly from the outside, from customers, from prospects, from market research, from partners who are close to the client, from industry trends. I go look at what the analysts are saying. I also go talk to lost customers from that company, because what I want to get to is the truth in evidence about the value, the so what the company brings. I also want to forget the corporate legends, because quite frankly, a lot of things that we believe as internally as truths in the market are not necessarily true. They're urban myths, they're corporate legends, and we don't want to base our positioning around what we think. We want to base our positioning around the evidence and what our market and our customers think. So we gather the evidence, then we apply that evidence to the three pivot points, and we'll talk about the pivot points in a minute. But the pivot points are basically three distinct messages about your company, your product, and your market that work together to tell the story of your core value. We then apply those pivot points and the evidence we've collected to the situation at hand. We map the right combo of the right pivot point to the right evidence for that specific audience, and we tell our stories. It gives us common themes and messages. We present it in a story that's relevant and impacting and compelling for our audience, and it works, whether we're trying to do a 15-second elevator pitch or whether we're into a full hour presentation in front of a specific customer. We can use our positioning matrix to craft any story we need to tell. So now let's talk a little bit about the pivot points, which are the cores of our story. They tell the who, what, why, and how of any story. They are about the market, which is focused on the customers we serve. It's about the company, which is focused on the expertise we bring to that market. And it's about our solutions, which is about that so what question, what's the value we offer? Okay? For each one of these pivot points, we have one clear, concise statement. Sometimes I'll have up to three, I'll have anywhere from 3 to 5 core statements that are the value propositions of our company, okay? And then I apply those statements to the fourth side of the equation, which is the specific audience. So the way I create those statements is first I go gather the evidence, right? And the evidence will often show us things about our story that aren't exactly what we expect to see based on what we've learned internally. So before I ever start to craft the pivot points, I go out and I talk to the audience and understand the evidence that's out there, right? By the way, I collect the good evidence and the positive evidence about the company, and I also collect the bad evidence, because a bad story that's in the market will come back and bite you in the tail if you don't know about it, especially with the power of social media. So as we plan our evidence stories, we also need to plan the evidence that shows, yes, we had something bad go wrong, and here are our plans to be able to change that. So I then so what everything until I hit what the core value is, and the result is I have 3 to 5 core statements about my market, my company, and my solutions that are the pivot points. Those 3 to 5 statements allow me to tell a top-level story. Then we add the evidence piece, all right? So first let's talk about pivot points and how we find them. When we look at our market, which is pivot point number 1, we want to think about customers. Think about who we serve, the value we bring, and the expert or leadership position that has allowed us to create. The focus is forward. I don't want to focus on the history. I want to focus forward and share our vision of what we see happening in this market, what we know about our customers, what we believe will be their next challenges and problems, and how we're applying our expertise to solve those problems. I want to leverage my expertise to educate, because just like in an RFP, when I want to set the RFP ahead of the sale, I want to educate my market on what's happening with them so that they understand that I have the expertise to be able to see their challenges, see their future, work with them hand in hand, and I understand them. So the first thing I do is I create my pivot points around my market, right? I find what is that core value I bring. For example, here's a pivot point. Here's a statement for market. We serve more SMB financial services companies than anyone, anywhere. Now, what did that just tell me about the company I'm positioning? It told me that, number one, I'm focused on small to mid-sized businesses, right? I'm focused in the financial services area, and I serve more of those clients than anybody in the business, which means I am the market leader. That's my pivot point. Now, underneath that, I add the evidence to support that. I add the evidence about my position in the market, so I talk about all my firsts. I talk about, stories of my market expertise. I talk about how many companies I've worked with, how I've grown, my growth, et cetera, the kinds of problems I've solved. I talk about my vision for where that market's going and the problems I see as a company and what I'm doing to solve them. I apply market research. I use customer stories about customers who are actually experiencing that already as market leaders, who are they're recognizable customers, and I use them to show companies, yeah, see, I'm working with the leaders in your space. I talk about my expertise both with customers but also in the market at large. It could be in the form of communities that I support and standards group, how I'm leading the industry. That's how I create the pivot point and the experience story, the evidence story around my market. Now, if you look at the ebook that's associated with this webinar, I also have questions in that ebook that you can ask yourself to help you find that evidence. All right? So that's the market. Now let's go on and let's talk a little bit about your company. So your company, this statement, this pivot point is all about your leadership and the value you bring. And this is where evidence is key. For example, I've had 70% growth. I own 40% market share. My executive accomplishments in this around that are inherent in this company, the awards my company's reached. There are so many different ways we can spin evidence. But what I want to make sure I do is I want to make sure my focus for my company is not about my products. My company positioning is not equivalent to my product positioning. My company positioning is about softer values. It's about my expertise, my leadership, the quantitative evidence of my growth. Right? I have to look beyond my product today, because in 2 years from now or a year from now, that product may not be my focus. I want to focus my company messaging, pivot point, and evidence around my own track record. All right? Now, I don't necessarily want to talk about my track record myself. I want to leverage third parties to tell the good things about me, because third parties are much more believable than I am, because I've lost my credibility as a vendor. So the first thing we do is we come up with a pivot point statement that summarizes who my company is. So for example, we've doubled every 3 years, and we now have over 150 small to mid-sized financial services clients. All right? So my market statement was I serve more SMB financial services companies than anyone. My company is we've doubled every 3 years, and we have 150 leading SMB financial services. So I now know I'm a leader, who I serve, the market I serve, and that I'm a hot growth opportunity. That's from 2 simple statements. Beneath my company, what I leverage is the evidence to prove that company statement. I talk about accomplishments today, yesterday, and in the future, and I apply those accomplishments based on customer value. I talk about my legacy expertise and how that applies to the future. I tell stories around what my company's done, where it's led, where in the space that I've provided leadership, where I've helped lead the market in new directions that have been successful. This is where, if I have a known issue, if I'm a turnaround, if I've had a blip, this is where I want to fess up. I want to make that statement, yes, we had some problems with X, Y, and Z, and here's what we're doing to fix it. Here's the results to date, and here's what we expect to have happen, and here's when we'll come back and tell you how we've resolved that. You fess it up, because if you're in a market, these customers know, and you may as well tell the truth about it, and put it under the table and put it away, rather than having it hiding in the background to come back and bite you. So that's how we talk about our companies.